Well, that's a very good question, and again, I can just offer a very tentative answer again. There are many who have kind of spoken about contradictions in Iqbal, and in fact, in this, not in this read, I think in this reading itself, particularly, for instance, his take on the Ahmadis, right? And people have said that there's contradiction. At one level, he's praising the Ahmadis, and at another, he's considering them as not Muslims, and so on. And Iqbal beautifully borrows from Emerson that only stones do not contradict themselves, right? But when I look at it, again, this is not a perfect, it's markedly inadequate in understanding, but when I look at Iqbal's trajectory as a philosopher, thinker, poet, I look at a certain kind of, there is a connecting thread. So for instance, the individual that is pitched in this particular reflection is not any different from, in my view, the individual that is pitched in Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, although that's a text that I don't think I have understood, and I don't think anyone has understood it as much as one should. Nonetheless, whatsoever little I have. So one thing that is very clear about Iqbal's entire, shall we say, philosophical journey is that the individual is an active individual. And this is to be situated in his broader understanding of the universe from the Islamic position. And the understanding of universe in Islam, according to Iqbal, is neither pessimistic nor optimistic, right? And it is here that he makes a case for the ego, right? That you can enter the world, and it gets very complicated because on the one hand, you're making a case for individual action, which is amal, and on the other hand, you also have to entertain this very powerful idea of destiny, right? And the human agency. How do you make a case for human agency in this overarching frame of destiny, right? And that there's something very Islamic about it. You can't really question destiny. You question destiny, you're out of the territory, right? But Iqbal very beautifully and in a very lucid way, he kind of brings the two together in the sense that the agency as a certain kind of unfolding of the divine will, but with marked consciousness and intent and will. So in my opinion, it is the latter. It's not the inactive, but very much an individual who is endowed with extraordinary degree of a reformist zeal, and therefore a certain kind of, which is why, again, man as a co-worker, so when he talks about God creating night and man creates lamp, and that kind of, and this is very new to Urdu poetry as well, man as a co-worker. And when man is even complaining, the human being is complaining, there is a certain kind of an intimacy that's there that is pretty much unprecedented. That intimacy is not to be found in earlier episodes of Urdu literature. So I would say that one thing that has been found, and which is why I think so many people have written on self and selflessness, and after a point it also gets a bit boring as well. Nonetheless, one thing that is to be found right from the start till the end of Iqbal's poetic philosophical career is that the individual is endowed with extraordinary potential, right? And of course, people can rightly so question him as well for all kinds of aspirations that he talks about. So for instance, his praise for few leaders who are not really that acceptable for any person who believes in modern democratic political setups. But anyways, he is what he is. So I think there is that continuity there, and where the individual is essentially somebody who is constantly, perpetually realizing the potential and unfolding his or her potential, of course, in line with the divine will. So he takes care of destiny, but he also makes a very pressing, forceful case of human agency. And then he also has some very interesting things to say, but that's again very on time. Very often we don't. Iqbal actually wrote on relativity, right? And it's a ridiculously complex piece. It's some other dimension that he's operating in. But and a Cambridge philosopher, MacTaggart, actually appreciated his work on the conception of time. And he was responding to some of the prevalent theories of time at that point of time. Very, very profound and deep, take on time. And again, looking at the question of destiny, Islamic idea of destiny, and making a case for the durée that he borrows from Bergson, the time question that he borrows from Bergson. So I would say it's always, as far as my understanding goes, and I stand corrected, but as far as my understanding goes, it's always the active individual. Otherwise, they are all soulless. Let me start with his and then, I might forget this one. So, you see, one thing that we can be very certain about is that Iqbal was one heck of a reader. The man had actually read quite a bit. And in fact, there are very few who can be his rival when it comes to reading. Ambedkar was definitely there. Ambedkar used to read incessantly and very passionately. In fact, this was the time when people had time to read. Now I don't think reading is in itself an aspiration. And tell me about it. I enter in the classroom every day and there is disappointment of one sort or another. But anyways, I would say that Iqbal was definitely aware of what exactly is he using when he used the word sociological. And the sociological is not just about the is. The sociological engages with the ought to be as well. So yes, he did not go ahead with social fact and whatnot. He did not, but there is another reading where the social fact bit comes out very clearly, where he says that I am developing a reading of a critical student, and that's pretty much what Durkheim writes in Rules of Sociological Method. I am discarding preconceived notions. That is the phrase that Durkheim has used. But anyways, I don't think at that point of time the English translation of Rules of Sociological Method was out. So I can't really say that he has borrowed from Durkheim or plagiarized or whatnot. But he was definitely aware of a certain sensibility in social science. So I think he was well aware of what exactly a sociological study pertains to. And if we read the piece and if we go through the lecture from start to finish, it's essentially a very meticulous dissection of a set of very core ideas in relation to the community, the Muslim community. So in that sense, it is, of course, in the early 20th century, this is as sociological as it could be. Now, the understanding of community right now with, the likes of postmodernism, post-structuralism is very different as compared to what was the prevalent understanding. So Iqbal, I think it will be unfair to not situate him in the intellectual, historical, academic context in which he was operating. Samir, in relation to your question, I wish, I hadn't allowed you to ask this question, because reconstruction of religious thought in Islam is always a puzzle. It's one heck of a puzzle. But if memory serves me right, Iqbal actually pursues very promisingly the idea of the prophetic, right, and the non-prophetic. And Iqbal kind of talks about the prophetic knowledge and experience one way, and the non-prophetic. And he gives a very interesting example, and this is one of the things that has stayed with me. So he talks about the night of ascension, when the Prophet has reached the heavens, and the Prophet comes back, right? And there is a Sufi saint who's famously, it is said that he said that, that Prophet Muhammad came back. Had I gone, I wouldn't have come back, right? But Iqbal says that, that's the difference. The Prophet comes back, and his progression is in his return, right? So, and it's also there's something also very foundational about it in terms of Adam's descent from the heaven. So when Adam is actually coming to the earth, there is a certain kind of progression that's happening in Adam's character. The human, the material is kind of acquiring a certain definitive presence in his life, and so on. So one thing that Iqbal is absolutely clear about, and even in this piece, the Muslim Community of Sociological Study, is that any claim to knowledge cannot be altogether devoid of religion. He is very clear about this, because knowledge is also constitutive, something that Foucault tells us much later. And there is always a certain kind of epistemic politics that's around it. But Iqbal is very clear, and this is so very often when we translate knowledge, we translate it as education. तो आप बहुत सारी जगहों पे आपको लोग कहते हुए मिल जाएंगे, तालीम हासिल करो, क्योंकि तालीम हासिल करने के लिए कहा गया है कि अगर चीन भी जाना पड़े तो चले जाइए. तो मैं उनसे कहता हूँ भाई तालीम हासिल करने के लिए नहीं कहा गया है. मतलब ये फुलब्राइट के लिए नहीं है कि चीन चले जाएंगे, अमेरिका चले जाएंगे. बेसिकली इल्म हासिल करने के लिए कहा गया है. एंड द प्रॉफिट्स, इफ़ यू गो बैक टू प्रॉफिट्स ट्रेडिशंस, देयर इज समथिंग वेरी क्लियर अबाउट the basis of knowledge. So for instance, all kinds of virtues that are associated with knowledge and the knowledgeable have got nothing to do with this worldly, right? It is foundationally, primarily, it is religious, right? So who is an alim? Alim is not just somebody who knows. Of course, that's a literal meaning. But when you go back to the hadith of the Prophet, which talks about the fazilat of an alim, and you know, what does the death of an alim imply? Well, this is not some PhD, doctorate person, right? We are unfortunately exempted there. We are not there. This is an alim in the sense that who carries with him or her the tradition, right? The prophetic tradition. So Iqbal was absolutely clear about it, that any educational initiative or endeavor has to be premised on religion. It's a combination, but it has its roots have to be in religion. Meaning that even if you're reading, and that's something that we find in Iqbal, that reading the who's who of Western philosophy, but the vantage point of argumentation is invariably Islamic, right? So he's borrowing from everybody in the 19th, 18th century, the titans of Western philosophy, but he is unapologetically, brazenly Muslim in his articulation. And perhaps that is, and which is why he has issues, it is also pointed out here, serious issues with the Maulavis, because the Maulavis are reasonably acquainted with the traditional stuff, but they are horrendously ignorant in terms of the contemporary, the modern epistemes, right? But if Iqbal was to be asked this question, that tell me what's the basis, he would straight away say religion, right? That religion is the foundation. So in reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, he is, of course, there are different, these are different lectures that look at different aspects of religious knowledge, prophetic experience. But in my opinion, he is absolutely clear that religion has to be the constitutive force. And for this, many people have questioned him. Religion as the basis of social order. Many scholars have questioned Iqbal's conception on that count. In relation to is religion possible, that is an anxiety that he is trying to address in the context of what he is proposing. So for instance, in the times he lived, the times he is responding to, the times in which he is living, there is a certain kind of preponderance of, shall we say, the non-religious, right? All kinds of, and this is where he has serious issues with Congress as well, that why is it, and not just Iqbal, Maulana Muhammad Ali Jawhar has also written about this, that why is it that every time a minority political argument is made, it is called communal, right? Why is it that politics cannot be articulated of a certain kind through the vantage point of, now of course this could be appropriated before the drop of a hat, and therefore there is a certain risk in making this proposition, but Iqbal was absolutely clear that politics cannot be devoid. In fact, his critique of secularism, or his critique of this what we call spirit matter dualism, is based on this, that Islam does not have this dualism. Islam, something that T.N. Madan would borrow from an iconic sociologist, that there is this the sacred kind of subsumes the profane, right? So is religion possible is in that sense a response to that anxiety. And of course for Iqbal it is possible. If religion is not possible, then why on earth would he take the trouble of making us bang our heads over these 7 lectures, as it were. But it is, and just to refer to to respond to, he is actually disruptive. He is operating from a very different register. So when we're reading Hegel, when we're reading Marx, we are basically we are part of a tradition, and there is a certain connecting thread. But in Iqbal, you do not have anybody who precedes him. He is the preface and he is the conclusion. Unfortunately, there's nobody later who would kind of continue the legacy. Of course, there are iconic scholars but not of the kind that Iqbal was. So he doesn't have anybody before him, and he doesn't have anyone who could have the, the acumen to kind of carry forward the legacy. Therefore, it's very unsettling, because he's talking about stuff that we are not, in university setups, we are not really accustomed to. We haven't really read that stuff. And he's bringing, again, different epistemes together. In conventional academic training, we work with epistemes in a very singular way. So for instance, he was talking about, Gramsci, critical school. There's a certain continuity. And suddenly you talk about Erich Fromm, and Fromm is disruptive, because Fromm borrows from Zen Buddhism as well, right? So Iqbal is very disruptive, which is why he doesn't really, he's not immediately accessible. There's a lot of work and labor, and for you, of course I can understand the trouble, for someone like me, who claims to be Urdu as his mother tongue, I can't get the head and tail of many of his writings. Not to say that I am one accomplished Urdu scholar, but I'm convinced that there are many, no offense, there are many Urdu scholars who can't get it, because it's not just a matter of language. It's also a matter of a certain kind of a philosophical packaging that is taking place in that one dense paragraph, which is responding to centuries of philosophical foundations, right? So I think this is something, but we all kind of struggle with this, and a bit louder. Yeah.
If you take, as you mentioned in Prof, there is something in action. More than theory, he's a person actually in action, knowledge in action. Right?
Well, not himself, but he's talking about action. Yes.
But then the question about the worldview, that's the question that I want you to answer. One thing that I just make it more specific. There are resentments for him, not only for him, Afghani, any other scholars before him, after him. There were great resentment for them. How have this great past, great glory of this Sassanids or Ottoman, or Mughal, entire things are actually coming into decay. This society or community has come into decay. What is this great resentment? Is it about his immediate realities that the Indian, he's being very conscious about the Indian, more than the Arab or the Ottoman. He was being very hopeful about this subcontinent, the Persian cosmopolitan. Once, if I draw, if I'm trying to draw his worldview, should it begin from something which is in the past? How the past glories about, or the great resentment, the contemporary difficulty that he had about his own time on the Mughal, or about the future? But is it continuing?
Well, I don't know if one can really zero down on a specific worldview, but I would say that Iqbal is somebody who kind of believes in a certain kind of blend of, or the coming together of, because again, something that I was referring to earlier, but I did not get I didn't get time to kind of speak about it at length. Islam is non-temporal, right? So if you take the time element out, then you are basically talking about an eternal flow of sorts. But in my opinion, again, if one were to kind of, take risk, give it a shot, I would say that here is a person who's kind of more about the days to come, and not really the days that have gone way past us. The past definitely comes, and in many compositions, in fact, he is one of those who've kind of charged up the community through a range of references to the glorious Muslim past. But I don't think that was the end. That was just a reference to a certain kind of potential that the Muslim had in terms of, charting his own destiny or her own destiny. So the past is there. But in terms of, if one were to kind of, again, take a shot, I would say that it is very much more of a visionary, in the sense that very future-oriented, and again, the unseen, and a certain kind of a vision vis-a-vis faith in the unseen, and a certain kind of a blueprint. Now, many people have ripped him apart for the various ways in which he's kind of gone in different directions. But that's something. Well, that's Iqbal, the man was actually simultaneously looking at so many things. So if there is incoherence, there is incoherence here and there. There is just, I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with that. But this is what I can say at the moment.
उल्टा हम ही पे सवाल बहुत परेशान करते थे, तो उनसे सवाल पूछने छोड़ दिए थे हम लोगों ने एक वक्त के बाद से. But anyways, a great professor. I'll not do that, because I in principle, I did not like this that he used to do in classes. And these were,
Can I pass a compliment? I just can't ask.
Yeah, you can tell him I was here.
No, for you I have a compliment. Like you are very humble in some way.
Well, he taught me to be humble. Harish did that. I did 3 courses with him. So anyways, so just to go back to what, so see, the dogma thing is something that I referred to. And see, rationalism will always be informed by a very different premise, right? Now, what Iqbal is talking about is that there is a possibility that the premise of rationalism and the premise of the Muslim worldview might not coincide. ज़रूरी नहीं है कि ये दोनों एक ही जगह पे इनकी जड़ें हों. And then he makes this argument, and I categorically pointed this out, that what is of national relevance need not be intellectually relevant. तो किसी भी चीज़ का अक़ली तौर पर सही होना इस बात की दलील नहीं है कि वो मिल्ली तौर पे सही हो. Right? Something that is good for the community might not be, from the vantage point of rationality, also true. Right? Now one can debate this. But this is the way, because what he is pointing out is that this conception of the universe, that the Muslim conception of the universe, can also be considered dogmatic. It could be considered as a dogma, and dogma is there in italics. तो अब डॉगमा तो एक ख़ास किस्म की चीज़ होती है. डॉगमा को तो हमें हर हालत में सवाल उठाना है. तो इकबाल बहुत ही वाज़ेह तौर पे ये बात कह रहे हैं कि भाई जो चीज़ यानी जो नेशनल यहाँ पे थोड़ा सा मिसलीडिंग हो जाता है, क्योंकि आज के दौर में नेशनल वी अंडरस्टैंड वेरी डिफरेंटली. But something that's to do with the life of the community and its functionality is not necessarily contingent upon its intellectual merit. ठीक, कि कोई चीज़ अक़ली तौर पे सही हो यही ज़रूरी नहीं है. तो बहुत सी, अब for instance one could, this is not to defend him, but one could just go back to his take on women's education, and Iqbal could very well say that intellectually it might not be very exciting, but nationally it is. अब आप उनसे बहस करते रहिए. That's the argument that he has, right? And as I said, that this is not to at all endorse, but this is just to kind of introduce ourselves to what is it that he was up to. And depending on our own acumen, capabilities and awareness, we can either disagree with him, discard him, dismiss him, or find meaning in what he's pointing out. There is no what should we say, there is no project here. ऐसा कोई एजेंडा नहीं है कि नहीं आज तो सब लोगों को इकबाल का फ़ैन बना देना है. आदमी है, वो भी बहुत सारी गलतियाँ कर रहे हैं. But this is the core argument. The national and the intellectual need not coincide. That is the argument that he's making. And generally speaking, it's a critique of, as I said earlier as well, territorial nationalism, because Iqbal, right after his entry in Europe, he was incessantly writing about territorial nationalism. And in fact, there are scholars who've pointed out that it is only after going to, in fact, there's a wonderful recollection as well by a scholar who says when he met Atiya Faizi there, and Atiya asked him to write something for him, Iqbal was well in a position to write some brilliant Urdu composition. He did not. He wrote a Persian composition for her. And this is the time when Iqbal starts writing in Persian, because there is a certain kind of a pan-Islamic idea that he is entertaining as a response to territorial nationalism. Because Urdu again is very territorial. And by seeking recourse to Persian, Iqbal is kind of making a case for transcending boundaries, or at least transcending the boundaries that are set up by nation states. So he is, so he's not writing in Persian before he goes to Europe. Rarely. But while he's in Europe, he writes in Persian, and once he's back, he's primarily operating in Persian as a poet. And much of the accolades that come to his door are on the basis of his Persian poetry. वो तो हम लोग उर्दू इतना करते रहते हैं, असली तो इनका रिसेप्शन ईरान में है. वहाँ जनता पागल है इकबाल के पीछे. And it's very rare that जो कहते हैं अहले ज़बान अगर किसी की तारीफ़ कर रहे हैं, भाई मैं मान लीजिए मैं फ़ारसी में शायरी करूँ, ईरान वाले कहें बहुत अच्छी शायरी करते हैं, that's remarkable, right? मतलब या उर्दू में शायरी करी, यहाँ के लोग हाँ कर रहे हैं, चलिए बहुत अच्छी बात है. बट कोई अमेरिका का शायर, उर्दू, कोई गोरा जिसको कहते हैं, अमेरिका में तो हिंदुस्तानी भी हो सकते हैं, वो उर्दू में शायरी करे और यहाँ के बड़े नक्काद ये कहें कि बहुत अच्छी शायरी करते हैं ना, दैट्स द मैन हैज़ गॉट इट, राइट, द पोएट हैज़ नेल्ड इट. So that is something that Iqbal did, and he was predominantly operating in Persian for the most part. But of course, Urdu happens to be also a source of his prominence. तो ये चीज़ है, इसके बारे में हम बात कर सकते हैं. रहने दें.
Perhaps we can take one last question if anybody has, or we can conclude. अगर किसी के पास नहीं है तो मैं शुक्रिया करना चाहूँगी आप सभी का, स्पेशली प्रोफेसर का, जो आए हैं इस गर्मी में और हमारे साथ डिस्कशन किया है डिस्पाइट फास्टिंग, डिस्पाइट द हीट, एंड एवरीवन इन JNU और जो भी JNU से आए हैं, बाहर से आए हैं, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आपका हमारे इनॉग्रेट डिस्कशन में आने का, पार्टिसिपेट करने का. और जी